Hi everyone, we have Barry Schwartz here going over some different SEO questions that we've got for him. We can go ahead and actually just get started with the questions. So the first one is, what are your thoughts on innovations like Cloudflare's optimization on Edge for WordPress sites? Is it a craze that's getting too much attention, especially as it seems like maybe more and more of this might be able to get solved by networks that serve up the web?
Yeah, I mean, there's two aspects to this question. One is speed important? And I think in general, yes, speed is incredibly important for users, for conversions, for pretty much all metrics you're looking for when it comes to your website. Is it as important for Google purposes, for ranking and SEO and search rankings? Not so much. I mean, I think it's a relatively minor ranking factor for Google. But again, it's a win-win situation. If you improve your speed in general, even if you get a little bit of ranking boost from it, which is probably really, really small, the conversions are getting benefits, the user happiness factors in general are just well worth it. Now, the question around, all these Cloudflare and other types of like CDN related types of solutions for making your website faster. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that automate the process of making sites faster. And should you spend the time manually trying to make your website faster versus using a third-party solution? And that really depends on what's involved. I think, I use Cloudflare services for my own site. I know AWS has a bunch of services as well. I know you guys have a service as well. So it all depends about your resources. Some developers like to be really hands-on and like go through the code and make things better that way. But if there's a way to just like plug and play and build on, like add a little, service to your website that will literally take your content, cache it, do whatever it can to make it much faster. I think it really depends on the type of your resources and what you want to do. So yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely worth looking into for anybody who's looking to make their websites faster.
Where do you think I feel like even though it's widely known that, site speed is not a ranking factor, people from Google have gone on different platforms and said, it's not a major one. Where do you think that all the, I don't know, hype about site speed and ranking comes from?
So Google has said that speed is a ranking factor. It's part of the core web vitals, and that's going to be part of page experience. It used to be back in the old days that it was only a factor of mobile rankings. So there's been discussion around this, but when it comes down to it, it really is a tiny ranking factor. Google has said that, but I think when you look into when you're somebody in the weeds like I am in SEO, I'm really involved in every little detail that Google talks about. Yeah, I know that Google said it's a really small ranking factor, but when Google announced page speed and all these core web vitals and all this other stuff, the message was speed is important, and that's 100% true. But when it comes to rankings, it's not that important. So I think Google doesn't mind people thinking that it's really, really important because it helps your users, it helps your conversions. And I think also SEOs don't mind it because it's one more item on their checklist that they want to, provide in their audits. And obviously tool providers love it as well because it's another reason why you should make your website faster because Google cares about it. So I think it's just a lot of things that Google says turns out to be kind of overblown, and some things they don't say also becomes, and speed is one of those things that it's tangible. You can actually measure it. There's lots of tools out there. So it's something that you can actually provide an audit and actually accomplish. Whereas, writing better content, that's really more subjective. It's hard to measure exactly. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why SEOs and a lot of developers actually focus on it a lot.
Right. The next question is, what do you think of Google's investment in news via Showcase? Is this getting ahead of some antitrust discussion and recent legislation in Australia and some that's brewing in the EU, or is Showcase looks to be a cross between Google News and Discover, even with $1 billion price tag? Is this something that publishers should be happy about, or should they be concerned? Does it make Google more of a CMS, and isn't that what publishers are fighting against now?
Right. So I suspect this is specifically a reaction to or an action towards all the bad press and regulations going around outside of the US, and now maybe even inside the US. The $1 billion investment in these papers, not just online publications, but newspapers is obviously cash being thrown at the problem, and Google has a lot of cash, as you know. So I think that's one part of the announcement is, hey, we're giving you guys a lot of money. Please, realize that and be nice to us and stop trying to like take us to court and get more money. Although I don't think it's gonna make a difference. The second thing is the Google News Showcase feature, which was announced with that. Um, it's interesting. I think we should look at it from a publisher's perspective as a new opportunity to get your content into new areas in Google search. It's only live, I think, in certain areas right now. I forgot the exact locations. I think Brazil and Germany. I think those are the locations maybe that it went live in. And it's also available only in the Google News app on Android. And that's going to be expanded over time. So I think they're launching it, Google News on iOS. Will come to Google Discover and Google Search in the future, but right now it's just in certain areas just to be tested. And I guess maybe to test the waters to see if the actual governments really care about this. I assume they're not going to, but I think in terms of publishers who are listening to this, this is an opportunity. You should look into this, see how you get your content to show up in these areas. I think there's like a bunch of little features in there, like timelines and bullets and related articles. So if you get your content and your stories into those areas, it's just another way that you can actually get traffic from Google. Obviously, Google, when it comes to Google Discover, that's kind of more like a news feed. And this is kind of like you said, a bridge between the two, between Google News and Google Discover. So just another opportunity for publishers to get their content out there.
All right, the next question I have is, you recently interviewed Martin Splitt. He talked about some lessons learned in Google's attempt to be more transparent. Why do you think that Google's transparency efforts seem to be met with rolling eyes and some skepticism? And also, why do you think Google will iterate itself and grow more transparent? Or, sorry, I can't speak today. Do you think Google will iterate itself and become more transparent, or do you think they'll actually pull back and be less specific about things like authority in the future?
Right. So I've been covering Google search for a long time, and obviously the transparency has changed over the years. There's been, in the early years, very little transparency about what's going on. Back in the Matt Cutts days, super early, before Matt Cutts was out there. Obviously, Matt Cutts is no longer with Google. He's now with another company. But before that, he was actually nicknamed Google Guy. He didn't go by Matt Cutts. So the transparency was very, very minor and small back then. And now that has changed. Matt Cutts kind of promoted more transparency, building the Google Search Console developers team and relations team, which was formerly known as Webmaster Trends and Analysts. They're really about helping bridge some of that transparency. In addition, Danny Sullivan's now obviously no longer at Search Engine Land. He's now at Google, and he's really all about trying to bring as much transparency to the SEO and developer community as much as possible. So Google, I think, is the most transparent they've ever been. I don't think it necessarily helps them. I think the more information Google tells us, the more questions we have. So, is speed a ranking factor? Yes. All right. How much of a ranking factor? Only a little bit. What little bit? When does it make a difference? What are the different speed metrics we should be looking at? Is it too slow? Is it too fast? Is it, if I'm a little bit faster, a little bit slower? So the questions keep piling up. The more information Google gives us, the more questions we have. And when we get information or we don't get an answer to a certain question, then we get upset. So I feel like it's kind of like a lose-lose situation for them. They're trying to be transparent. They're trying to give us information, but as they give us more information, we want more information. We want more and more and more. It's never enough. So it would be very interesting to see if they do scale that back a little bit. They've scaled it back here and there, then increased it. But I think I personally kind of miss the old days of less transparency. I like when SEOs try to figure out what's going on. Even if it might be wrong, I still like, it's always interesting and fun to say, let's experiment with something. Let's see if it makes a difference. And obviously, correlation, causation, there's all those studies around that, doesn't make a difference. But a lot of people just don't trust Google. So then if Google says something and they test it, and they say, hey, well, Google said speed is a ranking factor, but yet my tests show it's not really a ranking factor. Great, that's another study. Or the opposite. The whole thing around click-through rates and pogo sticking and user experience metrics and so forth. And does Google use Google Analytics or Chrome data? I mean, this is the debates that have been going on for years and years, and Google's been saying consistently over time that no, they don't use these types of metrics, but nobody believes them. So Um, One is, do you trust Google? Two is, when they're more transparent, does that help? I don't think so. If they're less transparent, does that help? No, but it's just basically a lose-lose situation.
Yeah, I think that you kind of spelled that out perfectly. It's definitely one of those scenarios where, what's the book? If you give a mouse a cookie,
Right,
and then
exactly.
you just kind of start snowballing. Um, you mentioned earlier the Google guy. Is there one set, Google guy that you would say is in the world of SEO? You mentioned Danny Sullivan earlier. Of course, everyone talks about John Mueller. Gary, is there any one person you'd point as the Google guy?
There's no one Google guy anymore. Like, Danny Sullivan's not an engineer. Like, Matt Cutts wrote parts of the algorithm. He was very, very involved. It was a much smaller team back then when he first started Google. He was employee number like 90 something or even 70 something, I think. So he was very, very involved from the early days. He got his hands dirty. He knew about launches. He was in all the launch meetings. So he could actually talk about everything. Danny Sullivan's not an engineer, so he doesn't know the programming behind it per se. But he's very involved. He actually works directly with the Google search team, whereas John Mueller, Gary, Martin Splitt, those three from the search relations team, I think they're called, they work not on the Google search team, but they work with all the different teams. So they work with Search Console team. They work with parts of the search engineers. They work with spam. They work with a lot of people. So there's lots of different teams, but yet they don't always necessarily work directly with the engineers. They don't have access to the code. I think Gary does work on some code projects. So it's not like one person has everything in their brain like the Matt Cutts of the old days. Not that he had everything in his brain, but he had a lot. And I don't think there's really one Google guy anymore. I mean, the head of Google Search is not really talking much. Um, I think he was the one who actually came out with the Google Panda update and other things as well. His name is Pandau, I think, how you pronounce it. And then there's lots of different players. I mean, Paul Har, that doesn't really talk much about search. The ones who really know everything, or most things, don't really talk much. So it's hard to hear from them. Whereas John Mueller and Gary and Martin Splitt, even Daniel Weisberg from the search developers team who works for Search Console, there's lots of different people out there that are employed for doing this type of stuff. And they technically know a lot, but yet they don't know everything.
Right. The next question is, with the new release of Google's Web Story WordPress plugin, do you think Google will start putting more emphasis on web stories in Google search? And if so, what do you imagine that looking like?
Yeah, I think they will. I think even today, I'm not sure what day this is being released, this video, but today they actually just launched web stories directly in Google Discover. So that was a big launch today or yesterday, actually, yesterday afternoon. And Google renamed web stories. They were initially not named AMP stories or those types of things. And now they're web stories. I think a lot of the AMP resources, Google was very, very big into AMP, and they still are, but a lot of the resources they had in AMP is now pushing towards web stories. So I think, yeah, you'll see a lot of push from Google here. And I think it's a really great place for publishers to really start to experiment with if they haven't yet. There's WordPress plugins that make it really easy. It's in general, you don't even need a WordPress plugin. It's very easy to implement. I personally haven't implemented it yet. I will. I hopefully will. Will this last forever? No, but I think if you experiment with it now, I think whoever experiments with it now, I think in general, they'll probably get a lot of return on their investment from it. So I think publishers should really take notice of it.
Have you, I forgot what article I was reading, but they were talking about how web stories are more snackable. Have you consumed a lot of web stories? Is it something that you kind of interacted with? Or is it something that is kind of still developing?
So I personally, I mean, I've seen it, I play with it. I tend to stay away from that type of stuff. I'm more of a read text and not the visualize stuff type of person, although I produce a lot of videos and this is a video. So most of the internet wants a video oriented visual, answer to stuff. So I think that's the way to go. I'm more old school back in the old days of just, text, based stuff. So can't go by me. But personally, I'm not a huge fan of the web stories format.
All right, I just have one more question. So there seems to have been a lot to keep up with last month, from the different indexing issues to rumors of a core algorithm update and so on. What are the top trends or announcements from last month that publishers should pay attention to?
There's a lot going on in the past month. I'll try to sum it up very quickly. If you want to expand on anything, just let me know and I can speak about that. So in the past week or two, there was a bunch of indexing issues. So on September 23rd, the SEO community, and I was one of the first to report it, noticed a lot of changes in the Google algorithm, rankings, and so forth. It turned out that it was a bug. There were canonical indexing issues, canonicalization issues, where Google was picking up the wrong URLs. There was also mobile indexing issues. Google confirmed it started around the mobile indexing issue started earlier this month. It spiked around last week, and the canonicalization issue started around the 20th or so. So our timeline was pretty much accurate, and pages were just dropping out of the index. People were like, "Where's my traffic? What's going on?" Things are starting to return to the index. I think yesterday, Google, or the day before, said that 50% of the mobile indexing issues were fixed, and 25% of the canonicalization issues were fixed. Although the canonicalization issues only impacted about 0.02%, I think, of the index, and the mobile indexing issues only impacted about 0.2% of the index. But if you think of that, of a trillion page index, it's billions of pages. So it's a lot of pages. Before that, Google had indexing issues with news indexing. It was about a 3-4 hour outage of not being able to index news. That happens every now and then. So that happened just before this whole issue with the canonicalization issue. And then also before that, they had issues with top stories not showing in the carousel, top stories carousel. So if you're in the publishing world, a lot of this type of stuff may have impacted your traffic. So if you see a lot of weirdness around those dates, the 23rd and like 19th and around that time, I have stories. You can search for them, and hopefully my site will come up, although probably not. But if you do find it, you can search on. Maybe I'll give you links so you can add it to the show description. And then in terms of updates, I mean, there's always updates going on in the algorithm. So right, so the 23rd was not a Google algorithm update; it was more of a bug. On the 17th, that might have been a bug as well, but we noticed algorithm updates. We had some local algorithm updates earlier this month. And then one interesting thing related to algorithms is that Google said that you can recover from a broad core update prior to a broad core update. Although the way you recover is not so simple. So I kind of delved into that, which is a very interesting topic. I'm not sure how much you want me to go into each topic, but it's like a high level thing of what's going on the past month around these issues.
Yeah, I would definitely love those links, and I can definitely include those in the notes so people can access that and kind of dig into that easily. I think that's all we've got for today. Is there anything else that you want to add in?
No, I mean, a lot of the topics you discussed, again, I think publishers should take this all experiment, because what might work on one site might not work on another site. So just keep experimenting for your own website, see what works for you. And if you see something's working, do more and more of it, and try other things. So keep experimenting. That's the thing every publisher needs to do.
All right, Barry, thank you so much for taking your time and doing this interview with me. Looking forward to our next one.
Same here. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right.